Good morning, and message to anyone who controls the audio and the AC in this room. It's absolutely freezing. I'm Jane Harmon, and President and CEO of the Wilson Center, and I brought a prop. This says, Books at Wilson. And when you go outside and buy David's book, which is now #1 on Amazon International and Amazon Cyber indexes.
Yep.
It's a twofer. When you buy his book, this bookmark will be in the book. Why is that? Because he wrote this book at the Wilson Center. And in case you missed that, that is why it is such a good book, and it is doing so well on 2 indices. I guess that would be the better word. And we're thrilled to have Wilson Center scholar David Sanger for a discussion about his third book called The Perfect Weapon. And I actually read the book. I showed him, I underlined it, and he said that is hurting my chances of reselling it on eBay. But I actually read the book, which is a fabulous read. Read it. This is book 3, and I would point out that book 1, The Inheritance, was written at the Wilson Center in 2009. His second book somehow wasn't written here, but a lot of his second book is summarized in the third book, so it really doesn't matter, and I won't even mention that book. So he knew he was going to get this. This is a fascinating and terrifying read in equal measure. His book lays out the state of the cyber threat worldwide and why it may be, in Henry Kissinger's words, quote, far more complex and far more dangerous than the nuclear age, which began, the nuclear age in the Cold War. In his spare time, David is the national security correspondent for the New York Times and has been a member of 3 teams that won the Pulitzer Prize. While writing this book, I know this, he turned out numerous 3,000-plus word articles for the New York Times, which he says, and I believe it because I read them all, many people read all the way through. There's a way to track this. And only David could write these long-form articles plus this book at the Wilson Center.
If you deduct my mother from that list, though, it shortens the...
No, but, and they were fascinating. And some of the stories are in this book and some weren't, but it's an amazingly productive chapter in your life, and we all commend you. So, enough of bragging about our scholar, and now let's go to some questions. So I'm going to sit down and ask David some questions. Okay, I don't know why I was standing up there, but I was. So, David, in the preface of this book, you say, quote, in the cyber world today, we are somewhere around World War I. That was interesting. And you point out that 10 years ago, there were 3 or 4 countries with serious cyber capacity. Now there are more than 30. How did this happen?
Well, Jane, before I get to the answer to that, I want to say thank you to a couple of people, starting with you, for putting up with me a second time here. It was great. It's a fabulous place to write a book because the community here is so nurturing. The place actually allows you to close your door and think for a little bit, which is pretty rare in Washington. So, but both the ability to close the door is rare and the ability to think is rare, and for the timing. Rob Litvak is here. Rob made all of this happen right there. And Meg, who's over here. And Eliza, would you raise your hand here? Eliza Sebanius was the lead research assistant on the book, also had some Wilson status here, and made the whole thing happen. And one of the things I've learned about Wilson is it's not only great for the scholars you have coming through, but for the young crew you have coming through who make all of this work. So thank you, and thanks to Eliza. To your question, so think back to the World War I era. I've seen in the opening of the book when Wilbur and Orville Wright decided in 1909 to show off the Wright military flyer, sort of military version of their aircraft, to a bunch of generals. And they went up to what is now the soccer field at the University of Maryland at College Park. And they're great photographs from that moment. The soccer field was a muddy mess, as it frequently still is. They ran the flyer around, and these Army generals came up. And, of course, they had never really seen, they had read a little bit about the Wright brothers, but they hadn't really seen anything like this before. And the first thing they said was, "This is fabulous. We'll just sort of take this thing and put it up and run it out over enemy lines and see where the vulnerabilities are and bring it back. They'll tell us, pilots will tell us where the vulnerabilities are, and then we'll run the cavalry over around the vulnerabilities." Okay? Nobody had thought about arming the damn thing, okay? And no one had really thought about where the technology could take you. That next year, the United States made, or a year or two after that, made 14 sort of prototype military flyers. By the beginning of World War I, we made 14,000. By that time, somebody had figured out the arming thing, and the Red Baron was going on. And by 1945, we had combined that technology and nuclear technology and used it to take out Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That was a relatively short 30 years. So when I say that we are sort of where we were in World War I, it's because in 2007, if you go back and you read the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, threat assessment that gets, the declassified version gets released each year in Congress, Jane, you remember this from your time there, and you go to read the cyber section, it won't take much of your time because there's no mention of the word cyber in 2007. Now, a few months after the threat assessment came out, Steve Jobs showed up and showed off the iPhone for the first time. And the fact that you have seen this expansion of cyber capability and the fact that the iPhone came out that year are not entirely unrelated, because that began to spread the number of targets. And now it's way beyond your phone. It's the security camera in your house got taken over in large numbers for botnets a year or so ago. It's your internet-connected refrigerator. I'm not entirely sure why we need one of those, but they exist. It's your autonomous car. And all of these feed into why we have become more vulnerable. We have gotten vastly better at cybersecurity, and yet the targets that we are establishing out there, the ways into the network, are expanding so fast that they're wildly outpacing our ability to go defend. So when you ask the question, why are 30 or 40 countries now doing this, the answer is because they've determined it's the perfect weapon for them. It's inexpensive. You can dial it up and dial it down. It's fairly easy to do without attribution. Eventually somebody may figure out where it came from, but they won't instantly. And because you can do it at a sub-war level, you can do an attack at a sub-war level, you can pretty well assure that you're not going to get a military response unless you do that big cyber Pearl Harbor that takes out all the electricity from Boston to Washington.
Okay. So you also say, I think in the preface or early in the book, that we are struggling to maintain our lead. And you also note that there has been the absence of a kind of grand strategic debates that surrounded the first nuclear age. Why are we struggling to maintain our lead? Will we maintain our lead? And what about the lack of a grand debate about the rules of the road in cyber?
So the lead part is easy. It's dirt cheap to do this stuff. I mean, you basically need some laptops, some connection to the internet, some teenagers, 20 and 30-year-olds, and several cartons of Red Bull. And basically, if you've got that combination, you're good. So it's not like nuclear, where if you don't have the plutonium or the uranium, you're out of business. And that's why right now we still only have 9 countries with nuclear weapons. And that's, 65, 70 years into the nuclear age. And we have so many in cyber. The lead is diminishing in part because of the ease of entry, but it's also diminishing in part because we haven't figured out the deterrence piece of this. You mentioned Kissinger in your intro there, and as I got ready to write this book, I sat down and reread Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy, which is a book that Kissinger wrote in 1957. And it was his first book after his thesis was produced. And the book itself was the first real explication of what he thought a grand strategy for the United States of integrating nuclear weapons into our national security policy should be. Now, when you read it today, it's a little bit shocking because he basically makes the argument that limited nuclear war was a good option, that, or at least if not a good option, the least bad option. And it's not a position he's held on to later on in life. But it was at least an effort to sort of grapple with what would happen here. We have spent so much money building a cyber offensive force, almost the amounts of money that we spend on maintaining our nuclear force. They're cheaper to build, as I say, but we've been building up a U.S. Cyber Command that now has 6,200 cyber warriors in it. They're spread out over a number of our military units. The new head of U.S. Cyber Command and the NSA, General Paul Nakasone, very impressive person, is described in this book as the one who oversaw a program called Nitro Zeus, which was a classified program to unplug all of Iran if we had gotten into a big conflict with them. That was averted by the 2015 nuclear agreement that the Obama administration reached. I hear there's a problem with that now. The answer to your question here is we've gotten into a cycle now where, because we have made first use of cyber weapons in Olympic Games, the Stuxnet attack on Iran, against the North Korean missile program, which is described in the book, and because other countries have also begun to do this, that we're now in a significant arms race, but without the strategy to contain it.
Which is very scary. Just using that as a softball for a shameless ad for the Wilson Center, we do have on Friday afternoon something called Cyber Boot Camp, which I know you know about, David. It is the brainchild of Meg King over there, who runs our science and technology program. And what it is a school for Hill staff, bipartisan, bicameral, who self-select. They have to get a recommendation from their parent, a.k.a. their member of Congress. But they come down here, and we teach them how the Internet works. It's amazing how few of us, that would include me, really understand how the Internet works. We know how to use apps, but we don't know how the thing is put together, what its vulnerabilities are, at least, and those vulnerabilities evolve by the day, and what some strategies are to protect it, both legislative strategies, imagine that, or other things you can do with hygiene or the private sector could do and so forth. And so that may not be a grand strategy, but it's a strategy.
No, it's a start. And Meg was kind enough to drag me away from my computer one day and have me come talk at the up on the Hill to some of the Hill staffers who were there. And I was very impressed with the degree to which the Hill staff, no doubt in part because of the Wilson Center's education program, was sort of deeply into this and understood it. And I remain totally shocked by, well, no longer shocked, let's say resigned to, the fact that it's still a point of pride for members of Congress to say, oh, I don't use computers much. I don't really understand this that much. I go to my grandchildren for, it was cute 10 years ago. Today, it's a little bit like saying, I don't have the time to understand nuclear weapons, so I'm going to leave it to my grandkids to figure out what our strategy is going to be. And if you put it to them that way, they sort of take a step backwards in shock, because they rarely get called on it.
Yes, but there also is, I'll say this, I'll use me as an example, something about brains that have had to adapt to the technology that are not as agile. I know you're a very young person, David.
Absolutely.
As my grandchildren's brains.
Well, that may be the case, but you don't really you need some rooting in the technology, but you don't need to be a coder to figure out some of the geopolitics of this. I'm certainly not a coder, and I'm glad you're calling me young, but the truth is otherwise. One of the reasons I wrote The Perfect Weapon here, Jane, was that I was concerned that we had a huge number of books about how to protect yourself on the internet, two-factor authentication, all the different things you should go do. But we don't have a whole lot about why this is happening and how it's changing geopolitics. And I was out recently at Microsoft and talking to a group of CEOs that they had gathered, and they asked me to come do a sort of early version of the book pitch. The book wasn't quite out yet. And what struck me when I was talking to people at the reception after it was they said, we have endless numbers of people coming through trying to sell their services to protect ourselves, and no one coming through explaining to us why this is happening.
Well, it's a really important point. Let me stick to Congress for one more second, and it may explain why the grand strategy debates aren't happening, at least given the current cast of characters in elected positions around the world. My deathless prose is that politicians are analog, but the problems are digital. And I still think that most people in very senior positions in political leadership don't understand this stuff. And so the laws that are passed are prescriptive. You can't do this list of things. But of course, the agile hackers in our midst who are, our grandchildren, you don't have grandchildren. Do you have
I don't have grandchildren, no.
You're a young person. But anyway, the agile hackers in our midst are, a third of their age and can figure out back doors to almost everything that's on a laundry list of what you can't do.
Let me give you the one exception to this politician's rule, which is pretty good. So Xi Jinping is he's closer to our age, okay? But he, when he gives speeches in China about the 2025 project for becoming self-reliant in these technologies and their 2049 goals when they want to be the largest economic, military, and technological power, there's usually bookshelves behind him. And one day, somebody in the intelligence agency said to me that they had had somebody go and translate the titles of the books that he put behind him. Now, maybe these were fake books that were empty, okay? They were all about artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles. You get the whole bit. I'm waiting for the White House speech in which that bookshelf is used behind any president. I mean, it's not just President Trump. President Obama didn't.
Never
do it
seen
either.
a bookshelf behind this president.
Yeah, right.
But hey. But I'm looking at Robert Daly, who heads our Kissinger Institute on China and the U.S., and who's big on stuff like this, attributes of Chinese culture. Does that sound plausible that those are the titles?
Those were all very carefully scripted, tied to Made in China 2025.
Yep.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah.
I'm sure he didn't, and I doubt he's read them. But it was just interesting that was the political prop. Yeah.
Yeah. So, continuing, you have fascinating stories and chapters about the Operation Olympic Games, which had a lot to do with this Stuxnet issue that has been in the press over years, the enormous damage caused by the Snowden leak. I know that up close and personal from my time in Congress. The emergence of China's capacity, North Korea's capacity. But I think the most interesting part of the book is about Russia. And not only the emergence of the Russian threat, especially Russian meddling in elections, especially ours, starting in 2014, but the Obama administration's diffidence in light of that threat. And I think everyone would be interested in hearing about it.
So the diffidence didn't start with the attack on the Democratic National Committee. What's interesting when you go back and you reconstruct the history of what the Russians were doing in the United States is It begins back in 2009. We take you into an attack on the Pentagon that really woke everybody up and led to the creation of U.S. Cyber Command as a full command. But gets truly interesting in 2014 when there are attacks on the White House, the State Department, and then the next year on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And the initial thought was that these were all basically about espionage. Nobody had the imagination that they would take these documents and make them public and so forth. And the NSA came in to help the State Department and the White House clean the Russians out of these systems. And what's interesting is that at the White House, the Russians basically stayed around. They fought the NSA hackers back, not because they were getting anything terribly important out of the unclassified White House email system, but because they wanted to show that they could stay around. Mm-hmm. And there was a 2-week battle that the U.S. government basically kept pretty secret during this entire time. The White House never named the Russians as the country that was coming into these systems, even though all of us who were covering this knew it.
And why?
Well, it's an interesting question. They believed that diplomatically it wasn't going to be any particular gain to name them and shame them, and that since we do espionage and they do espionage, why not handle this in the usual quiet channel? Now, I argue in the book that this was a very big mistake, because if you're Vladimir Putin and you're thinking, okay, if they're not going to publicly make us pay a price for going into the White House and the State Department, the two of the lead institutions, or the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who's going to care about the Democratic National Committee, which is basically staffed by a bunch of college kids, right?
Right.
And so there was no deterrence, no penalty set up. And so then comes the DNC hack. And initially they think, again, it's just about intelligence collection. Until the British call in March of 2016, or thereabouts, and say, we've been monitoring the GRU, the Russian Military Intelligence Channel, and we're seeing DNC documents flowing through the system. You guys have like a big problem out here. And the White House was taken by surprise. The FBI had been trying to talk to the DNC since September of 2015. It was, I mean, in some ways, it's almost the funniest part of the book. I mean, they call over to the DNC, the FBI agent gets connected to the help desk, just like all of you. When he finally gets a hold of somebody who's working in the IT department, they don't believe he's a FBI agent.
Right.
They spend 9 months trading phone calls back and forth and basically doing nothing. There are babies in this world who were conceived and born in the time it took the United States to wake up to the threat of what was going on here. The President Obama, said he was first made aware of it in June of 2016. Well, that's well after the FBI, by months, by nearly a year, the FBI sort of came into this. And then once it goes into the White House, as you suggest, there's this big debate about how to go confront the Russians. And some people have some pretty big, interesting ideas about how to go do this. Toria Nuland, who was at the State Department, a friend of yours, Jane, had some real penalties she wanted to impose on the Russians. Cut them off from the world financial networks, expose
SWIFT banking system,
expose Putin's billions, expose his connections to the oligarchs. But in each one of them, they came up against the usual problem, and I don't blame them for being cautious about this, of what happens if the Russians come back on election day, because they knew they were inside some of the voting system, and actually play into the Donald Trump meme that the election was fixed.
Right.
And since everybody in the White House knew that Hillary Clinton was going to win anyway, why not wait until after Clinton was elected and then they could begin imposing costs on the Russians? Well, something else happened, and it hasn't quite sorted out that way.
Well, they did go public on October 7th. You have that in there.
Without naming Putin. But
Without naming Putin, but Jay Johnson and Clapper had a joint press conference announcing properly that election voting machines should be part of our critical infrastructure. I guess the good news is they're so old that it's pretty hard. They're not networked together. It's pretty hard to take them all down at the same time. But at any rate, that was the same day as a certain other small story in the news, right?
that was the day that the president's tape came out as he was getting off of the bus. So, and these things, so three things happened that day. Firstly, now they actually didn't do a press conference. They just turned out a statement, which was underplaying it. And it was interesting because President Obama decided to have them do it rather than have it done at the White House, where it would have gotten more attention. But he didn't want to appear to be politicizing what was going on. So that was at 3:30 in the afternoon, this announcement comes out. At 4 o'clock, the tape comes out, okay, sort of washing all the other news, out there. And at 4:30, you saw the first release of the John Podesta emails. Now, maybe this was an enormous timing coincidence, just a really busy hour in Washington, and it's a big focus of the Mueller investigation about whether or not the timing here was just coincidental.
Well, the John Podesta email story, which you have in here, and which at least I know was a phishing exercise,
right.
where someone told Podesta that he needed to change his email. I guess his password. He needed to change his password, and he wasn't controlling his personal email. Some others were for him. And
there was a communication error with the person who was handling it.
And they believed it and surrendered his password, and that was the bonanza that followed.
There are two great sort of little mistakes in here that tell you how little errors can change history. One of them is that one. The other is that the North Koreans, in trying to send fake messages to the New York Fed to get $1 billion out of the Bangladeshi bank, made a spelling error. Yeah. Which got caught by a German who was reading it in English, okay, and realized that you don't spell foundation, fandation, F-A-N-D-A-T. It's just like your mother said, proofread everything, So, and that's what meant, that was the only reason that they only got $81 million out of this instead of $1 billion.
Well, let's all remember that one.
Yeah.
Okay, so just two final questions from me. Formulate your brilliant questions, which I'm going to hope to recognize you in a minute. One is about responses. I know another conversation in the Obama administration, and I think it was in the book, but was how to respond in a way that doesn't trigger a counter response that's more harmful than the original hack. And this kind of paralyzed people for a while. And one of the ideas was don't necessarily respond with a some cyber intrusion. Respond in another way.
That's right. And that's become, across the Obama and the Trump administrations, that's become a fairly common thought, which is you're not limited to responding to cyber with cyber. Especially important if you're dealing with a country like North Korea, which has fewer IP addresses, I suspect, than this building complex does, right? So, there's an official quoted in the book who says, how do you go in and unplug a country like North Korea that can't turn the lights on to begin with, right? So you've got to begin to think outside of merely cyber for cyber responses. And the Obama administration was creative about this. They did some sanctions against the North Koreans. I don't think that was enough. Against Russia, you may remember that at the very end of the president's term, within days of the time he was leaving office, he threw 35 diplomats who were really spies out of the country and closed 2 or 3 facilities, one of which you learn in the book was sitting over a large underground telephone trunk cable, which the Russians had bored down through the ground and plugged into. But in some ways this was, as somebody I quote in the book says, the perfect 19th century response to a 21st century problem. These were not terribly effective responses while they were non-cyber responses. There was one cyber response the administration did, also pretty mild against the Russians. But it raises this big question of how you control the escalation. And Rob here has written a lot about escalation dominance and the theories about that, particularly if it comes to a place like North Korea or Iran or a nuclear power. Certainly that's been a big issue back in Soviet days as well. But escalation dominance is as important in the cyber realm as it is in the nuclear realm, but very different in how you control it.
Okay, so if President Trump called you today and said, David, hi, David, congratulations on your book, which I've just read cover to cover. You're my guy, and I need a good strategy against Russian meddling in the 2018 election. Because guess what, David? I've figured out that the Russians are meddling in the 2018 election. What would you suggest?
Well, we've just moved from the nonfiction to the fiction part of the conversation. First of all, I'm not sure if you got to it, Jane, but there is a moment from last summer where President Trump does call me.
Yeah, I have it here.
It's right after he meets Trump. President Trump meets Putin. And he says in the course of this conversation, well, President Putin has assured me that it wasn't the Russians who did the hack, and has said if it was the Russians, we never would have seen this hack happen to begin with.
Yeah, right.
And I asked him to sort of compare whether he believed Putin or the assessments that he got from General Clapper, from John Brennan, and others who provided the study during the transition. And he said, those guys are so political you can't believe them. So that conversation would make me think that the conversation you described here wouldn't happen. But I've got a little list of things I would suggest. Okay, so the first is he was off to a good start. He had two people in senior posts in the White House who had a really good understanding of these issues. One was Tom Bossert, who was here at the Wilson Center just a few months ago when I was working on the book, came by for a visit. He was the Homeland Security advisor, and he had a good background in cyber. And you may remember that the morning he was here, we spent a lot of time discussing cyber strategy. 2 days after John Bolton took over as National Security Advisor, he was told his services were no longer needed, and he was out within hours. He had a deputy who was the cyber coordinator for the White House, a man named Rob Joyce, career NSA official you'll read about in the book, who used to run the TAO, the Tailored Access Operations Unit of the NSA. That's the unit that breaks into foreign computer systems. They're essentially the sort of cyber special forces of the NSA. If you're going to design a defense system for the United States, not a bad idea to start with somebody who has spent his life breaking into foreign state-run computer systems, right? He has returned to the NSA, and National Security Advisor Bolton has announced that the cyber coordinator's position is being eliminated.
Right.
Because clearly we were over-coordinated in the U.S. government on issues of cyber. The first thing I would say is build as serious a cyber structure within the White House to deal with these questions as you once had and that other administrations have built. Second, charge that group with developing a strategy that actually answers the question, when does the U.S. government step in to retaliate against foreign nations, even if you don't announce exactly where those limits are? And what is the responsibility of the private sector? President Obama took the view that you can't come in and defend every bank in the United States or they won't invest in their own cybersecurity. I think that's a reasonable position. But there is some top limit of cyber attacks that are going to call for a national response. We haven't really thought our way through that. So I would say that needs to be taken as very seriously as everything else does. And then Eliza spent a lot of time on the book working on these questions of what kind of norms, what kind of agreements you could reach internationally, because not every answer here is technological. A good deal of them are going to be political, as they were in nuclear, as they have been in chemical and biological. And while it's imperfect, Brad Smith of Microsoft has come up with some proposals, as have the leader of Siemens and some other places, for essentially a cyber Geneva Convention, which operates outside of U.S. government. Remember, the Geneva Conventions were organized by the Red Cross, not by governments, to begin to set some norms of what we will and will not attack and what we would expect would not be attacked here. Now, this is going to be hard. I mean, Jane, I think you and I would agree if we sat down and made our list, election systems, off limits. Electric grid, if it's going to affect civilians, hospitals, communications, emergency services, all those kinds of things. You could easily imagine setting a set of global rules that say, we're not doing this the way we're not gassing civilians, right? I'm betting that the U.S. intelligence community would not sit still for those, because they would step in and say, hey, you may remember, we meddled in some elections in Italy in the 40s, in Latin America in the 50s and 60s, in Iran in the 50s. We didn't meddle in it, we ran a coup. So do we really want to say that we can never go do that again? We have operations like Nitrozeus to unplug whole countries. Countries include the hospitals. So when I say we need an open and public debate, it's because this is actually too important to keep classified.
Yeah, and I personally would applaud that and say we missed having an open and public debate also on our roles in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we are paying a high price for that.
That's right.
Final question. I brought a prop. This is an article you did not write.
Good.
It is called How the Enlightenment Ends. It is in this month's issue of the Atlantic magazine, and it's by a kid named Henry Kissinger. And the point of this article is that, stunningly, at only 95, he has schooled himself on another technology called AI. And he says in here that AI is a potentially dominating technology in search of a guiding philosophy, and he predicts that if we don't handle it correctly, it could end up handling us incorrectly. That's basically what it says. So what about AI, its connection to cyber, and is this even more dangerous? And is this the topic of the next book you're writing at the Wilson Center?
Well, I'll take that as an invitation, and yeah, I accept. AI is going to be a next manifestation of what you're reading happen in, this is sort of current history. And what it will do is speed up a lot of these responses, and in that way, make them a lot more dangerous. So let me give you an example that merges what Kissinger did at age 30 with what Kissinger's doing at age 95. Supposing you believed that a foreign power was inside the command and control system of your nuclear weapons. And therefore, when you are under attack and you press the button to go respond, nothing happened. Supposing you believed that AI has been used in a way to anticipate each of your responses and basically start off a cyber attack that would keep you from fully responding. You would end up being tempted to hit the button earlier so that you had a backup system to it. And so you're so shortening the decision space because you basically have computers commanding computers in the response that you bring about the kind of civilizational problem that Kissinger is responding to here. This is one of the reasons that you saw an uprising at Google last month by the engineers who did not want Google to participate in a Pentagon project to basically use AI for the next generation of drones.
Yeah, and it was fascinating because Google has announced that it will not seek to renew the contract.
They had to back down in response to a rebellion on the part of their young engineers in a pretty libertarian corner of the country, I admit. Now compare this to the Cold War, not that either of us is old enough to remember the Cold War, but it was almost unimaginable that people working at Raytheon, General Dynamics, Boeing, would have stood up and said, we can't participate in a new technology that might be used for military purposes like this. And that's the difference between the Cold War age and the Silicon Valley age. Because in the Silicon Valley age, they're not just building for the government. The government's a tiny part of their markets. They're building for international consumers who believe the American intelligence agencies are probably inside their products anyway, even if they're not.
So we could discuss this for hours, but we want you to discuss this. We have about 18 minutes for questions. Please raise your hand and identify yourself and ask a question. Don't give us a statement, because I'd like to cover as many people as possible right here in the second row.
Adam Powell from the University of Southern California. Across town right now, there's a meeting called Defense One Tech Summit. And to your last point about Google, former Deputy Secretary of Defense Robert Work said that Google may be creating a moral hazard for itself because they've just opened an AI research center in China, and that the Chinese military will have access to all of their information. Your reaction?
Sure. So this is the other part of the dilemma for all the American tech companies, because to operate globally, you have to be willing to do your research globally and sell your products globally. So to give you just the more plebeian example of this, Apple, which has fought the U.S. government on encryption issues, and I think somewhat reasonably, because the government wanted to be able to create a back door to get into any iPhone. And of course, once you drill that back door, the Russians and the Chinese rush on in, right? But in China, what has Apple done? They've agreed to keep all of the Chinese traffic on a Chinese iCloud, essentially, that the Chinese government will have access to. There are apps that the Chinese will not allow them to sell in the App Store for use in China because of the spread of information, including the New York Times app, not that I take this personally. There are all kinds of restrictions about what networks they have to go use. And you have not heard Apple issuing the kind of protest to this that they've issued in the United States, because they know it won't get them anywhere. But it does create a double standard. And certainly, if you are doing AI research in China, you've got to assume the Chinese government's going to get at it. Now, I don't have a huge problem with that, because it's not like if you don't have your center there, the Chinese are never going to figure out AI. They seem to be pouring a lot more resources into it than we are.
And they may beat us. I'm looking at Meg.
Yeah.
Become dominant in AI.
They may well.
Yep. Okay, Rob. Rob Litvak is the senior vice president here. He is our expert on all things nuclear.
Thank
You
you.
would also drop by my office every once in a while to see how many publishable words I've actually created,
Well,
which I found a good sort of motivating factor,
Yeah,
Rob.
and he got quoted a lot in your stories, so it all worked out.
Yeah.
Yes, Rob.
You both are on retainer still. I want to actually pick up on your last comment, David, and relate it to the nuclear issue, because in the nuclear issue, there is it's a technology over which there is substantial state control. You have non-state actors, but Al-Qaeda did not have its own uranium enrichment program. What you described in China is state, we may object to it on civil liberty grounds and personal freedom, but a state asserting control or attempt to control this domain. And thereby it opens the door to controlling content. If the threat from cyber, because it's a proliferated technology, and when the Russian hack occurs, there was a claim, hey, maybe it was a 400-pound guy, is to create a structure where there's greater state control over the ability of individuals to kind of use this technology to, pursue nefarious ends. And the question is that the type of thing, as we move to a regime of trying to control risk, is that a feasible possibility?
Yeah, it's a great question, because one of the big sub-themes of The Perfect Weapon is we came into the internet age thinking that it was going to spread freedom, basically. The more people communicated, and I would go with Bill Clinton when I was White House correspondent. We go to China, and he'd give these great speeches at Beijing University that basically said, if you read between the lines, the more people use the internet, the more it undercuts the authority of the Communist Party. Well, he got that one wrong. It turned out that the Communist Party figured out really how to go control these technologies. And now, after the Arab Spring, so has General Sisi in Egypt, and so have any other number of dictators around the world. And they have figured out that the fact that the internet's got to run through a fair number of small choke points. For all we discuss about the cloud, it's not up in the air, it's running across cables that the government controls, that they can use it for social control. So to your point here, one way to reduce cyber attacks would be if we required true identity on the internet. If I knew when Rob and Jane and Eliza and Meg were on the web and that it was really them and we could verify them, then whenever an attack came, I'd be able to sort out pretty quickly who was behind it. The problem is this would be a godsend of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, who want to have exactly that kind of control over the internet in order to repress dissent. And we haven't grappled with, as a matter of policy, which one of those values is more important to us. Keeping the internet safe, being able to identify and attribute attacks, or whether giving dictators what they want is, something we can live with. And, part of the answer here is going to be technological, but part of it's going to be political.
But there may never be an adequate political answer, as you said.
There hasn't been an adequate political answer in chemical, biological,
Right.
nuclear weapons.
But at least
Why
there
would
was
you
a
expect-
Geneva Convention that said what the answer was supposed to be. Whether
Yeah.
that's enforced, I don't know. Just thinking about this and how hard it is, and how who these hackers are, who they really are. They're sort of anarchists for hire.
Well, some
the
of them are,
kids.
and this is why treaties won't work in this area.
Right.
Because it's too easy for governments to hand off their work to patriotic hackers, criminal groups, teenagers, and so this is not going to lend itself to the kind of treaties we used in the nuclear age.
Right. No analog outcomes. Any questions in the back? Okay, in the middle with glasses, right there. I'm looking at you.
Thank you very much for the talk. My name is Laura Olop. I'm an intern at the National Defense University, College of Information and Cyberspace. And I have a question regarding Russia's aim to create the cyber sovereignty by 2020, I think. So in that regard, can we expect that Russia becomes more aggressive in cyberspace if it is able to achieve that goal? Like, does the threat increase from the US, from the West perspective in that regard? Thank you.
Well, every bit of evidence that we have so far is that Putin recognizes that this is the perfect weapon for him because he can't take the United States and NATO on directly. He could threaten them, maybe he can harass them, and we've seen more bomber runs off of the European coast, and we've seen submarines running, including with giant scissors on the end, going out, scoping out where those undersea cables that run the internet are, and it's scared the hell out of many people in the Pentagon, as described here in the book. But I don't think you're going to see him directly invade a NATO country because he understands what he would lose. And if there's a lesson in Ukraine, it's that he doesn't need to. The subtitle of this book, Jane read the title, but she didn't read the subtitle. The subtitle is War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age. And I chose those with care. The war part is what people are using cyber to try to avoid. The sabotage part is what we're all doing because we think it doesn't let us into open conflict. And that's where the Russian strategy steps in. And the fear factor is that if you can undercut people's confidence in that nuclear system, in your election system enough, then they're going to wonder whether or not the vote they cast is actually going to be for the candidate they pull the lever for, or whether when they get into their autonomous car, it's going to drive them to the supermarket or it's going to drive them over a cliff.
Right.
And
that
Once you've
those
created the
fears
fear, you
could-
really undercut the sort
Right.
of things that hold society together.
I just point out that the Russian cyber attack against Ukraine and Georgia were against countries not members of NATO. And
That's
I
right.
wonder if that was carefully considered.
It
I
was
assume
carefully
it was.
considered, and the chapter on Ukraine is called Putin's Petri dish, and it's because every single thing that the Russians ultimately did to us here in the elections, they tried first in Ukraine.
Hala Esfandiari is sitting in her seat in the dark in the back. She always sits there. She is the founder and first director of our Middle East program, an Iranian American who was imprisoned by Iran. Took a global effort to get her out, and this, I'm sure, is going to be a great question.
David, how would you rank the progress that the European countries have made in countering any cyber attack, and also India, who is quite savvy when it comes to technology, internet, and so on?
Great question, Hala. So some of the European countries are doing better than others. The British are much better than they let on, and I told the story before of GCHQ, but because one of the things that Snowden released was a lot of the GCHQ documents, we actually have a pretty good sense of exactly where the Brits are. And they divide the world up with the United States and with some of the other of the Five Eyes countries, the English speakers of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the U.S., and Britain. And they're quite good. The French are getting better. And it was interesting that they were smart enough, after they saw what happened in our election, to issue enough public warnings about what the Russians were doing that I don't think the Russians were actually much of a factor in the French election.
They were also shrewd at not. The Russians didn't know that the last day of the election they go dark.
I think the Russians,
France,
the
and
Russians
they sort
did
of
know it,
bumped
but that
into
going
that.
dark, that was an effective tool. It wouldn't work here, right?
Right. wouldn't work here.
But there are some things to learn from the French. As you will read in the book, NATO is basically hopeless, okay, in this case. So there was a great moment. I finally sit down. I find the retired guy who put together sort of the beginnings of the NATO Cyber Center. He decided to go back up and finish his graduate degree at age 65 or something. I really appreciate this. We go off and, have lunch in a grimy diner somewhere up in Boston one day, and he explains to me that when NATO opened its cyber center, it decided just to do it on NATO hours, which were 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, and that basically all the defenses got turned off when they left on Friday afternoon. So if you were the Russians, figuring out that maybe an attack at night or on the weekends might be a better way to go at this. As it turns out, NATO really only has a strategy now for defending its own networks, which it does poorly. And it has no counter-offensive strategy. So in nuclear, we've got there are all kinds of strategies that have been in place for decades for basically using nuclear weapons that are in the hands of and deployed by nuclear powers that are members of NATO. There is no equivalent plan in cyber. And the other thing I found a little bit hard to take was that when I went through NATO one time doing some reporting on this, I'm walking down the hall and there's a sign that says XP training, Thursday, 10 p.m. or 10 a.m. or whatever it was. And I'm thinking, XP is, first of all, hasn't been supported in years. And it's what allowed the Russians to get into Ukraine so easily because it's so ridden with errors. And I'm thinking, they haven't moved beyond XP?
Well, I've actually visited the Cyber Command Center at NATO. It's doing a little better. It's headed by a German now,
Yep.
von Loringhaven. It was the U.S. idea, and we did stand it up. And yes, it is somewhat hobbled, but
It is now
there is progress.
It's now running 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. I think that's actually an improvement. But But it is purely a how do we protect our own networks? There's no NATO strategy
Yeah, I think that's right.
for dealing with
I
everybody.
think that is right. Last question. Let's see here. Okay, last two questions, and you ask them. We'll ask them together. Okay, you're first.
Thank you. Hi, David. Greg Otto from Cyberscoop. I was wondering if you could address the row that's popped up in the 24 hours with you and Mandy and kind of broadly speak to what that means for the U.S. government strategy when it comes to hacking back. I know that's a big part of the book as well.
Okay, let's take the other question.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Mallory from the Millennium Project. A core theme of this talk has been traditional resources that we draw on to build deterrence won't apply or won't be adequate to prevent a cyber deterrent. So totally fictitiously, if you could come up with a regime to somehow prevent cyber attacks, where would you start?
Two very good
Great questions.
So first on yours, so there's a scene in the book
Yeah.
where I described going into Mandiant when they were going after Unit 61398. And they did a great thing, Mandiant, which was they actually went in and identified the Chinese PLA operators who were attacking American companies, stealing the intellectual property. And they were working on writing a report to make it public. And they came to me, and we spent a lot of time together because, what happens a lot in the world of computing reports is they're written in computerese as opposed to something that all the rest of us read. And so we wrote a very lengthy story that came out just as their report was coming out that explained just how this Chinese operation worked. In the course of that, they were watching individual Chinese hackers come into the networks of the companies that had hired Mandiant. And so you could see the traffic, the code that they were running. And in some cases, they showed me pictures that they had of the actual hackers who were there. Now, my understanding at the time that I was doing the reporting, it was 5 years ago, was that they had turned on the webcams of those hackers and seen them. And that's what I wrote in the book. They have since come back and said, no, turning on a webcam would be hacking back, on which there's some dispute. But anyway, we'll set that aside. That instead, they said, we saw these images because the hackers themselves had turned on their webcams, and this got captured in all the rest of the traffic. And so they turned out a statement yesterday saying, we don't hack back, we didn't turn on the webcam, Sanger was wrong. And I said yesterday, while that wasn't my understanding 5 years ago when I was there, I'm perfectly prepared to believe that I misunderstood something and that they got the images because the hackers themselves were on, because they were busy communicating with social media, talking to their girlfriends in some cases, so forth and so on. So the question here is less one of in that question of hacking back than how did they get the imagery. Mm-hmm. Overall, the U.S. has laws against hacking back, which means a company doing destructive activity against another nation. I'm not sure turning on a webcam, even if they had done that, would have constituted hacking back. But certainly if they had said they had destroyed that computer, it would. And this has been a big issue. It came up when Google was attacked by the Chinese, and there were Google engineers who wanted to go back and basically teach the Chinese a lesson. And people from the U.S. government had to step in and say, you realize if you do that, you can start a conflict here. And to the Chinese or whoever is getting it, they're not going to know whether or not the counterattack came from the U.S. government or came from a private company. And that's a big issue we've got to resolve. Now, to your question on what we would do, I'll have to ask Jane to invite me back for, the Wilson Center Conference on Cyber Deterrence, which wouldn't be a bad thing.
It wouldn't. Meg, are we having that?
We are now.
Yes, we are now.
Right. But a few things I would set up. There's got to be every country that comes into this and attacks the United States or other countries like that have to be persuaded there is some cost that will be paid. That does not necessarily mean it will be a counter cyber attack,
right,
but that it will not be a freebie. Because as long as it's a freebie, everyone's going to go use this. And we've got to start from that premise. Secondly, they've got to believe that if we have decent attribution about who it is, we're going to make it public. And that's going to make it harder for them to get investment in the tech sector, and it will turn them sort of into an international pariah. We do this in terrorism. If we believe that there are countries that are supporting terrorism, we name them, we shame them, sometimes we sanction them, and it makes life miserable for them.
Yeah.
It's not a bad model.
So I just point out we had decent attribution that the Russians were behind the election meddling, and we didn't do anything for several years, as described in this book. So everybody, I'm holding this up again, books at Wilson. Of course, you have to buy this one, but there are a lot of others that you should at least know about, all kinds of info on our website. And I hope you will agree that if David comes back to write his fourth book on AI, which he needs to write because it's a huge threat, exponentially harder perhaps than this one, if he is writing his fourth book on AI, I hope you will agree with me that he needs to write it here. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you, Jane.